Hi, I'm Grayson, and my group is presenting on race and sport. I'll be talking about the first article, which is how the natural talent myth is used as a weapon against black athletes. When talking about sports, there's always a comparison how it reflects the current culture, so talking about racism in sports is a reflection of what's currently happening in the US. This article covers excessive racism and criticism that black athletes face. In the article, there are multiple studies that are mentioned, and the first one I'm going to talk about is Dr. Cynthia Frisbee's, which she stated that black athletes receive significantly more negative media coverage than white athletes. After reading that statement, I wanted to see how true this really was, so yesterday I went onto Fox News Sports and I was looking through different articles, and the first negative one that popped up was right at the top, and it was about Antonio Brown and that he was charged with assault. To see if there's any negative media coverage about white athletes, I had to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page where there were a lot of smaller articles, and there's a few about different teams or select players. This leads into the first discussion question, which is, have you seen more negative media coverage for one race rather than another? In the article, the second study that is mentioned is one that's conducted by the University of Colorado, and in this they wanted to study stereotyping. And so they had a bunch of pictures of different quarterbacks of different races, as well as descriptions, and they asked the students to rank them. In a sample of just white students, they assigned negative attributes to the black quarterbacks and assigned positive ones to the white quarterbacks. The article also talked about commentators who stereotyped black athletes, which spread negative media about them, as well as how quickly fans can turn on their favorite players. Nowadays, with the use of social media, these sites are perfectly set up to spread negative comments about athletes. This leads to the second discussion question, which is, does media help fans stereotype athletes? To think about that question more, I've attached part of a TED Talk titled Race, Sports, and Telling True Stories by Morgan Campbell, who is a black journalist, and he's talking about the different stereotypes that black athletes face and how he himself has faced these stereotypes as being a black journalist. This is from the middle of the video, and so some context about what he's talking about is Olympic athletes and the media coverage that they get because of their race, as well as the different sports cliches that go on in the world and that people apply to certain athletes because of their race.
There's also the fact that white Americans dominate swimming, right? They win all the medals, but think about the difference in the types of stories you see about the black athletes who dominate their sports and the white athletes who dominate their sports. So you see these stories about why is U.S. Olympic swimming so dominant? They're systemic factors because we plan the best. We have the best technology, we have the smartest coaches, our athletes are the best prepared. Cool. That is probably true. We see stories about Michael Phelps and his big feet and his long arms, and that is absolutely true because he's an outlier among outliers, because all Olympians are outliers. That's why they're in the Olympics and we're here, right? And we see stories about Katie Ledecky's work ethic because she works really hard. Even if she works hard, all Olympians work hard, trust me. There's Olympians in this room, they can tell you. But even if she does work harder, cool, that is absolutely valid. But when we see stories about black Olympians succeeding, black runners for the most part, and even mainstream sports, football, basketball, it comes down to genetics. Newsflash, guy, anyone who's good at any sport has a genetic advantage. That's the starting point. It's not unique to black people. It's not an unfair advantage that black people have. Like, you just have to be born at the deep end of the talent pool. Sorry if I've dashed somebody's Olympic dreams, but that's how it goes. And so when I think about like the thread tying these stories together, again, it's this idea of white supremacy. And again, it's not always blatant racism and name-calling or violence. It's this idea, right, that white attributes, white attitudes, white norms, white hang-ups, and often white fragility, right, are the norm, and everyone else is different or deviant or pathological or some type of curiosity that we now have to hustle into the library, into the laboratory to study further, right? So when we think about how, like, Michael Phelps, USA Swimming, Katie Ledecky, these guys all get to be the main characters in the stories of their success, But when we talk about Usain Bolt, Shelly-Ann Fraser-Price, Eliud Kipchoge, Kenenisa Bekele, we're trying to take these guys and project ideas about entire populations, right? So what we're doing, or Anson Carter talking about racism in the NHL. What we're doing to these guys is reducing them from characters in the stories of their success to props, right? In a story about something else, in a story framed by white hangups, framed by white norms. And this is the lens through which you view these stories. And then the other thing that always emerges is the idea that these successful black athletes have secrets, right? We're keeping secrets from people. What's the secret? Is the secret the altitude, right, in Kenya? The secret, the barefoot running? What's the secret? Is the secret the yams? Nana, is it the fufu? What's the secret, right? Eat like a Kenyan, run like a Kenyan. Maybe the secret is the ugali, right? Think about, because you see these stories all the time. Ask yourselves if you've ever seen a story that says, to cut your backstroke time, eat like a white American, right? The secret is in the mayonnaise. Hands up if you've seen that story. You haven't. Well, I want to run this back. Hold on. I'm out of slides. Can I come back to Katie Ledecky? Here we go. Perfect. Yes, because the secret is in the mayonnaise. So here's the thing. The secret's not in the mayonnaise, by the way. The secret in some ways is the same for everyone. The secret is talent, preparation, execution. It's not the mayonnaise, it's not the ugali, it's not the yams, it's not the soil, it's not the middle passage. Because if the middle passage made black people good at sports, it wouldn't explain the success of all these guys from Kenya and Ethiopia who are still in Africa and never made the middle passage, right? But white supremacy is a thing. It's a thing. When I talk about white supremacy, again, as a norm and as a way of thinking, and how it gets expressed in sports, so we need to discuss the idea of level playing fields and of merit, right? Because what does white supremacy say about a level playing field? White supremacy says, given a level playing field, white people will come out ahead most of the time, right? And if you don't think this is true, go to some company where everyone with a good job is white and tell them to diversify. And what they'll say is, why should we diversify? We don't want to hire tokens, token women, token minorities. We just want to hire the best.
Hi, I'm Megan Michaels, and today I will be talking about race and sport alongside Grayson and Eric. And the article that I will be talking about today is called Consider This on NFL Draft Weekend: How We Talk About Athletes Might Betray Racial Bias. This article talks about the interesting stereotypes that affect how athletes are perceived, especially in college and professional settings. And while we were talking in class, I remember talking about how sometimes people stereotype who should play what position in sports. So an example of this would be in this article, the author states that 97% of the running backs in the NFL were black, while 82% of the quarterbacks in the NFL were white. So I think an interesting point that this article brings up is how in youth sports this is very different. In youth sports, I think that there is a sense of innocence and freedom that children bring to the table. And in this article, it states how once an athlete hits high school and then college and then goes on to like a professional team, this kind of all goes out the door. And once money and image are combined with sport and brought into the conversation, players are more racially organized into positions that fit societal standards instead of playing positions that they love. And I think that this is really sad because I feel that sports should be something that children should use to explore and investigate themselves, and instead they are just racially profiled to fit into what society thinks the position they should play should be. And I think instead this directly teaches youth the roles of race in sport, so it just kind of creates a road that then everyone follows. Another interesting theme that I think this article presents was how strong the media influences the perception or outlook of players. And in this interview with Pat Ferrucci, who's a University of Colorado professor of journalism, He talks about how the different descriptors that journalists use to describe athletes. And for example, when talking about Black athletes, their strength and athleticism are usually complimented, while talking about white athletes, their intelligence and knowledge of the game is usually applauded. An example that the article brought up of this, and it's also a pretty popular comparison, is between Tom Brady and Cam Newton. When journalists talk about Tom Brady, they talk about his intelligence for the game, but when they talk about Cam Newton, they usually talk about his athleticism and his drive, which is what makes him successful. And both of these players are extremely successful at their positions, quarterback, but they're always talked about differently in articles and stuff. And although this didn't happen in the past year, I found an interesting quote from a tight end in the NFL from the 90s. His name was Newsome. And he said that, "I think the stereotype can affect your mentality. If you grow up not seeing or hearing something your whole life, that starts to impact you. Like, I can't do this, or I'm not good enough to do that. And that becomes a part of your life." The impact that the media has on youth is very strong. When children grow up thinking that certain people have to play certain positions because of their race, this keeps racism in sports. And I think that if racially profiling positions changes in the NFL, and the media especially, this would decrease the level of influence of race in sports exponentially in the years to come. So I have 2 questions for you guys to answer. The first one would be, if you have played a sport, were you ever racially profiled into a certain position? And if so, like, how did that make you feel? And if you didn't play a sport where that happened, like, have you seen it in professional sports? And what did you think of it? And the second question is, I mentioned a way to maybe alleviate racial profiling in sport, but can you guys come up with an idea of your own to, like, stop this stereotype or encourage youth to stick with the position that they love? Thanks, guys.
Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm going to be talking about race in sport. I read the article, The Myth of Racial Superiority in Sports. This article is about a book called Taboo, Why Black Athletes Dominate Sports and Why We Are Afraid to Talk About It, by John Entine. And the article talks about why this book is wrong and how biological variation can't be used to validate racial superiority, especially in sport. The book Taboo by John Entine is about how genetic determination, mostly in Black history, is responsible for racial superiority in sport. The first 2 sections of it is about running events, mostly Black sprinters in the West African descent, and long-distance Kenyan runners. And the second section is about the history of racially motivated science, such as intelligence levels and mental abilities. This article says for that the book by John Entine to be valid in its assumptions, it has to cover 3 checkpoints, one of them being able to define Black and white populations, the second to find a consistent genetic difference between populations, and the third to find a link between genetic differences and athletic performance. Let's try to disprove mostly points 1 and 2. It says Entine associates African with Black, and in America and many other places, being Black doesn't mean being African, which causes a problem for Entine's argument. And on point number 2, it says how science has struggled to differentiate characteristics between populations, and that the more research that is done, the fewer differences they're able to find between populations. The next argument that the article uses to break up Entine's argument is strictly by numbers. In 2008 Boston Marathon, the winner was Kenyan, and however the 4 places after that went to non-Kenyan runners. And only 3 of the top 15 were Kenyan, while 4 of the top 10 were American runners. Although there's plenty of research to prove this wrong, the genetic theory of Black athletic dominance is hard to debunk because of the role or position stereotypes in media coverage in sports. In conclusion, the article says that race isn't a legitimate biological category, and it doesn't influence sports performance. So with that, Do you think that athletic performance is based on biological factors like race, or is it based off of environmental factors, or both? And what can we do ourselves about debunking this myth and stopping the spread of this racial stereotype that blacks are better than whites at sports? Thank you.